Are you guys ready?
We're ready.
Okay. So welcome to our second seminar of the fall semester. Our presenter is Patrick Cotter with PDC Engineers in Fairbanks. So we're going to be a little bit innovative here and see if this distance delivery system works. It worked pretty well last semester, I thought. Patrick has worked in community projects across Alaska, and he has degrees in ecology, biology, and geographic information systems. He is alumni at UIF. So welcome everyone, and welcome to Pat. See how this works.
Cool. Thank you. Can you hear me? All right.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, cool. Well, I will share my screen here so we can get started, and hopefully technology agrees with us here. And I apologize, my screen and my camera are in opposite directions, so you're gonna see the back of my head a lot, I guess. Okay, so hopefully you guys can see my screen. If I don't hear from you, I'll take that as a yes. Okay, so let's get started then. I put together a presentation today to talk about Arctic planning and environmental considerations. And once I started putting the slideshow together and thinking about what I was going to include here, it sort of went a little awry, I guess, in that it's going to go beyond environmental considerations, just kind of talk about what goes into planning for development or research or monitoring or anything that really might happen in the Arctic, with an emphasis on Alaska, of course. And I'm going to relate that back to the two different projects that I've worked on in the recent past here that sort of showcase some of the challenges that we're dealing with. So, as Tom mentioned, I'm Patrick Cotter. I'm a planner here at PDC Engineers, so I've gotten some cool opportunities to work across the state, but a lot in the Arctic. So Nome, Kotzebue, Little Diomede that I'm going to talk about today, up in Barrow or Utqiagvik, and across the interior and south coast and everything. So I'm here in Fairbanks, but attending here virtually. So I appreciate the opportunity. So before I really get into the two projects I want to highlight, I guess I want to talk a bit about and kind of set the stage for why there's this sudden interest in the Arctic and what's going on and what's the driver behind some of these projects, and whether it's development or research or just general, I guess, monitoring of the Arctic, if you will. So the obvious thing is that there's less ice during the summer. The ice melts back, more open water, and that's led to a number of things. So without the ice there, oil companies are now interested in offshore exploration and drilling. There's marine shipping that can go on that didn't before. So you've got a couple major things with the Northwest Passage and the Northern Sea Route. And I've got a pretty good graphic here and a couple slides to illustrate that. And a lot of that's related to, I guess, getting oil to market or other natural resources such as like the Red Dog Mine and that sort of thing. And then general shipment of goods. Last year, I think, was the first year a really large tanker was able to transit the Northern Sea Route with a full load, and it cut off 7 days from if they had to take the Suez Canal. So obviously some economic benefit to shipping with the opening of the Arctic. And then Homeland Security. So you might not think of Homeland Security when you think of the Arctic, but the Coast Guard has a real interest in monitoring and responding to incidents in the Arctic, whether it's foreign vessels crossing into U.S. waters, or if there's an oil spill or a tourist vessel is disabled, they need to be able to respond. And right now, the closest Coast Guard base is down in Kodiak, so that's a long ways from the Arctic if something were to happen. And then I think most folks are aware of some of the tourism that's been going on. This past year, actually, currently, the Crystal Serenity has done its second transit of the Northwest Passage, and that's a 1,000-passenger cruise ship that goes up the coast of Alaska, across the Beaufort Sea and through the Northwest Passage. And not only did they bring 1,000 passengers through the Arctic, there was a 1,000-passenger waiting list. So there's a huge demand for this sort of high-end adventure tourism. And then research, of course, we've got Coast Guard cutter Healy has been spending time in the Arctic, and then others related to oil and gas exploration. So really, I just wanted to, I guess, point out the some of those sea routes a little better. So everything's kind of upside down compared to how we normally look at it here, but Alaska, Point Barrow is kind of up here, Point Hope, and then Bering Strait's down here. And so the northern sea routes on this side, that's what the Russians have really been utilizing the last several years. And then the Northwest Passage has seen more traffic related to tourism, I guess, than industry. But eventually there's the thought that there could be a route straight across the top if there's no ice. And then in U.S. waters off the coast of Alaska, there's a couple oil and gas exploration areas, but I believe one or both of them have recently been, in the last couple of years, taken back off the market, so to speak. And I also want to point out the surge in activity. So it's one thing to say like there's interest in it, but then to really see the numbers. So these are a little dated now, but essentially these are 2008 to 2012 vessel activity in the Arctic. And what you can see is 2012 is the red line there, this huge spike in different kinds of vessels. So cargo and tugs have gone up, research has gone up, then the tanker vessels is the one that has really gone up. It's this one here. And that's mainly related to the Russians moving their oil across the northern sea route. But it's pretty surprising, it's the number of vessels transiting the Bering Strait has more than doubled in just 5 seasons, and it has continued to, these numbers have proved to continue on. So it's definitely getting the attention. So whether it's development or exploration or just the Coast Guard monitoring what's going on up there, there's certain things that they need in an Arctic community or a setting. And so there's a few things here I wanted to highlight. Airports is a big thing since most of our communities, our Arctic communities, aren't attached to the road system. The airport's really the lifeline for getting people, supplies, goods, getting people out of there if they're injured or sick and can't be treated locally. And so having airports with runways that can handle jet aircraft, whether that's for tourists that are embarking or disembarking a boat, or oil exploration crews that are swapping out shifts, or even the Coast Guard and the Air Guard are using larger airports in the Arctic as forward operating bases so that they can respond to spills or issues and be closer, be ready to respond. I think as we all know, the Arctic's a pretty harsh environment, so having a hangar available is something that particularly like development companies or oil development companies want to see in these facilities. And then having an airport that's open, or you can land in it during bad weather like fog and snow and that sort of thing. So having low minimums and those all-weather capabilities is really important too. On the marine side of things, you want to have a harbor that has a deep draft so you can get your bigger vessels in there, and it has to be sheltered so that during a storm you're not getting pummeled. And really in the Alaskan Arctic, harbor opportunities that are both deep draft and sheltered are pretty rare. So once you get around the Alaska Peninsula and beyond the Aleutians, you start to run out of these two elements in conjunction pretty quickly. So there's been studies on that, and I'll kind of allude to those, I guess, in a minute here. Roads, not as important. It's really the intermodal connections, I think, that are more important per se. So whether it's getting that ship to a port that then can transfer goods or people to an airport or some facility in the community over a road or a trail or whatever, that's probably the more important thing. And vice versa, bringing in people via air and putting them on a boat, or just bringing them to the community. And then within the community itself, oil development companies are looking at what are the facilities there that they could use. Are there housing, personnel quarters that they can put up staff in when they're changing out crews, or they're not able to move because of weather. They need to store fuel, whether it's for the vessels or helicopters or any other kind of aircraft they're doing, crew transfers, and then being able to work on these equipment, the hardware that they're using, whether it's in a hangar or just having the appropriate kind of facilities is important. And then the communication infrastructure. So just being there is one thing, but being able to communicate out and in a timely manner is something that is pretty important as well. So what are we seeing that are the real challenges here in developing the Arctic, or monitoring it, or researching in the Arctic? So I mentioned all the things that they're looking for. Well, a lot of that's limited. So the infrastructure in a lot of our Arctic communities is kind of the bare minimum for just maintaining a community at the status quo. And then even further, if you look deeper, in Alaska, we've got these hub communities like Barrow and Kotzebue and Nome that have more infrastructure versus the smaller, like a Shishmaref or a Wales or something like that, where it's a smaller runway, just a clinic, not a real hospital, not really any sizable hotels or crew quarters per se. And of course, everything in the Arctic is fairly remote. We're so far away from the road system and the major airports in Fairbanks and Anchorage. And that remoteness really does contribute to the cost of developing any kind of oil or mineral deposit, or getting crews out there to swap out on your cruise ship or whatever it is. And the short construction season as well. So if you're trying to develop the infrastructure, that's a whole different story, where only in the Arctic can a month cost you a year. So if your schedule falls behind in the design or getting your materials out to the site, then you've lost that construction season. That's a whole year before you're able to pick it back up again. And then finally, the competing interests of resource development, environmental protection. You know, not everybody on a Crystal Serenity kind of cruise wants to see an oil rig or whatever. So definitely some challenging elements to consider. So that's kind of the nitty gritty of the backstory here that I wanted to, I guess, point out before I got into these case studies, or really they're two particular projects that I've worked on. And they both happen to be transportation related, but I think they really illustrate those issues that we're dealing with in the Arctic. So in Barrow, we'll talk a little bit about the airport master plan that we did a few years ago. And that one was really driven by oil exploration. So when Shell and Conoco were going pretty hot and heavy offshore there. And then likewise, there was a growing population in Barrow at the time. And so there was, as the population grows, you end up getting more demand for aviation services. So a couple drivers there. And then the other one was Little Diomede. So that's if you're not familiar with where Little Diomede is, it's right smack in the center of the Bering Strait. And it's a very different community than Barrow. And really, they were facing a lack of transportation. And so the bulk of that study was looking at access for the community. But then also as a side shoot was what's the community's role in the Bering Strait in the future as the Arctic begins to see more and more attention. So we'll start with, I'm going to keep saying Barrow because I don't know if I know how to say that word, Utqiagvik. So what's Barrow got going for it? So it's got a bunch of attributes that really have brought it to the forefront of interest, I guess, for Arctic development and research and monitoring. And the strategic location is probably the biggest one. So you're right at the northern tip of Alaska. You're close to the Bering Strait, but you're not right in there. You're close to those offshore leases that were the real big driver and interest for like the Shell and the Conocos a few years ago. It's a fairly sizable community for the Arctic and the remoteness of it. It's almost 5,000 folks live there, and as such, they've got a bunch of infrastructure and services that really can serve as implements for helping develop whatever it is you're trying to develop. So they've they've got a good sized hospital. They've got a few hotels and places to stay, restaurants. There's a post office, which you might not think much of, but it's kind of important. It's a commercial service airport, so Part 139 under FAA means that it's got TSA, it's got a little terminal there, it's secure. It has regular maintenance and operations activities that the state of Alaska, so they keep it loud, ice-free, clear. There's a flight service station that gives, in rural Alaska, they don't have air traffic control towers at most of these airports, so a flight service station kind of acts as a tower in some regard and gives status reports and stuff to the flights coming in. They can get fuel there, and low minimums at the airport, let the jets come and go, even when the weather is pretty bad. The community has room to expand, so if oil development's coming in, wants to build something, some hangars, some quarters for crews, something like that, there's room to expand. And the utilities for the community are actually pretty low. They've got their own natural gas, so that keeps things down. And then recently, the quintillion fiber has been put in up there, so there's going to eventually be a connection beyond Alaska, but that'll be a high-speed internet connection to the world, really. So, also, it's the seat of government, so the North Slope Borough is headquartered there, so you've got access to government officials, politicians, that sort of thing. And it's the regional transportation hub. So not only can you base your operations or get the services in Utqiagvik, you can also hop on a plane and go down to Point Hope or over to Akasuk or Nuiqsut or something. And so if there's onshore oil or gas development or research projects or whatever it is, it actually has a good intermodal and inter-village connection situation there. So the location you can see, let me get my little buzzer going here. Okay, so Barrow, obviously way up here, pretty close to these offshore lease areas, and then the darker dots here represent where some drilling was going on back in 2012 and 2013. And technically Wainwright is closer, but just doesn't have quite the infrastructure that Barrow does. Although Conoco and Shell did base some operations out of there, and we're kind of going back and forth from Wainwright. And then this one you're going to have to get oriented a little bit here because everything's upside down, so to speak. So Barrow is down here now, and Anchorage is way over here. So the red lines are all of the 2012, marine vessel traffic that was tracked through there. And so you can kind of see the brighter the red color, the more vessels that were moving around. And so this area down here by Wainwright is the activity related to Shell's and Conoco's exploration back in 2012. So they were kind of going back and forth between Barrow, Wainwright, and their offshore leases. But there's a lot of traffic that is going through the Bering Strait, and a lot of deliveries of fuel and goods on barges and tugs going up to Nome and along some of the coastal villages there. And then on the Russian side as well, you see they're hugging the coast coming across the Northern Sea Route around to the Magadan Peninsula and everything. And then zooming in a bit closer here on Barrow or Utqiagvik, you can see, so the community is really quite built out, almost to the point where they're having a bit of a housing shortage, but they've got, water, sewer, and a hospital and post office, and the airport's got a big chunk of land there to the south. And then they've even got proposed residential subdivisions further along the coast there, and then they've got the Ilasagvik College facilities there and everything. So it's got a lot of infrastructure, and it's got a community, and it's got all these support things that really lend itself to just helping with any sort of Arctic exploration or development. I'll kind of touch on this, but why not somewhere else? And there are some other communities along the coast in the Arctic that you would think might have picked up the pace, so to speak. So just a few of them here, like Prudhoe, you know, it's really industrial and there's no community per se. Also some shallow water there, a little bit further removed from those leases. Yeah, it just doesn't have the support infrastructure that Utqiagvik does. Wainwright, so that was used a little bit for some offshore exploration, but it's not as big. The airport's not a Part 139 airport. The limited infrastructure there kind of, with Barrow being so close, that Barrow kind of takes the bulk of the interest. Kotzebue and Nome, they're a bit further from, you know, away from like the Bering Strait itself or out in the Beaufort and Chukchi Seas. They don't, I got a note there about limited community infrastructure, but really they have community infrastructure. It's just that in Kotzebue, the port isn't, there isn't really a port. Everything has to be lightered. So interesting fact, Kotzebue, shipping to Kotzebue is equivalent roughly to shipping stuff to Antarctica because everything has to be lightered from offshore so far. So it quadruples the price. And then utilities are pretty expensive in both of those communities as well. So if you're developing some sort of new facility, you're going to have some longer term costs related to just the upkeep and maintenance and utility costs. And then Port Clarence, that was part of the Corps of Engineers Arctic Port Study. And right now there's not really anything there. And so that lack of infrastructure and the timeline to develop it just hasn't been right for its use just yet. So the actual airport master plan that we did this over the course of 12 months from January to January of 2013 to 14. And that's fairly fast for an airport master plan. Typically they take like a year and a half or so. And the previous one had been done in the year 2000. So the DOT, all DOT airports essentially get a master plan update every 10 to 15 years. So it was overdue anyway. But then these new drivers were going on with Shell's offshore exploration, and then the Coast Guard's interest in having a presence in the Arctic. They were starting to base assets in Kotzebue and Barrow and other places. And so that kind of all came together at once. And so this master plan, you know, came to be. If you're not familiar with an airport master plan, essentially it looks out over 20 years and spells out what the sort of development and future condition of the airport should be. And to get there, you really pull together a whole bunch of different tasks. The biggest thing being the public involvement and the outreach. And so in Utqiagvik, there's a real big interest in what happens with the airport there because it's right on the edge of the community, a lot of different stakeholders. So we did a lot of interviews and public meetings, surveys. And so that public involvement for any master plan, but particularly for this one, is a really important component. So part of that is figuring out what's there, and that goes into our broader inventory. We do a forecast of aviation demand, so we look at things like the industry drivers, the population growth, the general economic drivers. Based on that forecast, we'll know what our facility requires in the future. So runway length, amount of apron, landside facilities like hangars and parking lots and everything. And then from that, we pull together some alternatives, identify a preferred alternative, and develop an implementation plan to actually put that alternative into action so that the sponsor, in this case DOT, can move forward and, you know, over the next 5 years, we need these things, you know, in 10 years, we need these things, and so on. So some of the things that the master plan illuminated that are challenging up in Barrow, kind of a mishmash of things, really, but the changing aircraft fleet. So Alaska Airlines is the primary passenger and cargo option to Utqiagvik. And they're moving away from some of their smaller jets. So they're moving to like a 737-800 is kind of their workhorse jet. And so that requires a little bit longer runway, a little bit different layout, those kinds of things. And then actually like Shell was chartering their own 737 flights in there too. So if oil exploration ever kicks up again, you start to run into limitations on the apron with multiple large jets at a time there. The airport is primarily developed only on its north side, and so there's really limited space to grow on the developed side of things. Anything that could be added would have to be on the south side, and that's on the side where there's no infrastructure yet. So that was a bit of a challenge there. In most projects, you see declining state and federal funds for these types of things, so that's something that they're going to have to deal with in the future. But then, and that kind of plays into the maintenance things, as the regulations for de-icing a runway change, and maintenance crews have to keep up with that and do more sort of manual versus chemical types of de-icing. That takes more effort, more money, so something they're facing. And then from the environmental perspective, all of the North Slope more or less is wetlands, it seems like. And so around Barrow, a lot of wetlands. You have protected species like eiders, there's yellow-billed loons. Offshore, you've got polar bears and that sort of thing. And so just lots of different forces at work here that make planning for and developing the airport kind of challenging. I mentioned that the north side of the airport's already built out, and the south side is where the interest in developing is focused. But developing anything up there is really expensive, and for multiple reasons. I guess the biggest thing is this lack of a material source or gravel source, and they've got one, but it's primarily used up, and to continue on would require the development of a new material source. And that essentially triggered environmental assessment because new gravel sources were in areas of good quality habitat for geese and ducks and those eiders, high value wetlands, that sort of thing. So we actually moved forward with design of some of these projects and did the environmental assessment as well. South side of the airport, even though the community has a great natural gas system and sewer and water and everything, that hadn't been extended to the south side. So that would all have to be put in. Who pays for it's a little bit of a question at sometimes, but that's part of the constraints there to really developing that airport fully. And I mentioned the wetlands and endangered species, but Utqiagvik's been there for a long time, and there's a lot of cultural sites and artifacts, and like even just beyond the airport runway and boundaries there, you can see some sites. And so any development, construction type development, would require somebody on site to be checking for this stuff and making sure that we're not disturbing anything there. So we went through this process and looked at all these constraints and talked to folks and did our due diligence, and ultimately came up with a recommendation here that shows over the next 20 years, a full build out would look something like this, where we've got some new parallel taxiways. We're setting up the stage here for development on the south side. So that includes like a new access road and identifying some new lease lots so folks can come in and actually lease those areas so that they can develop hangars or tie downs, whatever it is they're looking to do there. And we broke this into more modest chunks, I guess. So all of this in a perfect world will be implemented over 20 years in 3 different phases. The first 2 phases have a rough cost estimate of about $100 million. And then the third phase, which is more of the south side stuff, has a ticket of price tag there of around $70 million. So not chump change, but involved. So DOT is moving forward with some of this with the the new maintenance and operations facilities and expanding the apron there so that they can get some more space on it. So it is moving forward, and more to come, I think. So moving forward on Utqiagvik, they're going to keep going with some of those improvements that are in designs that have been built. The one thing that really has never caught on, so to speak, in Alaska is the public-private partnership funding options, and that seems like in Barrow a really great opportunity for that to, be tested out. And so that hasn't really come to fruition yet, but I think that it's still an option, and it's something that should be considered and might get, the state, the community that much closer to that full build out that they're looking for. And then, even though the exploration has stopped for the time being, it'll likely be back in one form or another. And so it's important to keep that in mind and make sure the airport's ready so that we don't go through this process again. So, shifting gears here, the other community that we did a transportation staging project for was Little Diomede. And so Little Diomede's on the other end of the spectrum from Utqiagvik in terms of infrastructure and population and a lot of things. So the last time I checked, there were only 112 people living out there. It's a very steep-sided island out in the middle of Bering Strait. They have a helipad, which you can't really see in the picture on the right. It's kind of just off to the left there a bit. But in the winter, when the sea ice is stable and locked up between Little Diomede and Big Diomede, they will clear off the snow and make an ice runway so that you can fly from Nome to Little Diomede in fixed-wing aircraft and land right there on the ice runway, which you would think wouldn't be that hard, but we tried twice and weren't able to get out there because of weather, and the season for the stable ice is getting shorter and shorter, and so they've got this smaller and smaller window of when the ice runway is really available, so to speak. And then the one other thing I would mention is that the community of Wales on the mainland is the closest community to Little Diomede, and there's a big connection between Little Diomede and Wales, and there's a lot of folks related, families are in both communities, and so a lot of times when they're traveling between Little Diomede and the mainland, usually back to Nome, they will stop in Wales, and there'll be some, family gatherings and that sort of thing. So it does have some things going for it, and I don't mean that like in a derogatory way, but so get my cursor here. Little Diomede's on this little rock out here. This is Big Diomede, and this is Russia on the other side. The location is, essentially perfect if you're talking about monitoring vessel traffic through Bering Strait or developing some kind of transportation, whether it's marine or air, whatever staging area. I mean, you're right there in the center. You're right on the edge of U.S. territory. And so the strategic location is, I guess you can't overemphasize that. And then the other thing is that it's deep water, very deep actually, around Little Diomede. And so I mentioned earlier about something you need in a port or harbor is deep water. They've got lots of deep water, almost too deep. And if I point out here real quick, so Wales is over on the mainland, kind of on this tip over here. And then these mountains on the far side, there's a community, or there was a community, it's not, nobody lives there, of Tin City, which is kind of a mining type of town at one time. And then Nome's off the map over here to the right. So I'm going to show this map again here. It's upside down, don't forget. But, essentially, Little Diomede is my white star there in the middle, and it's boom, right? Everything goes by Little Diomede. And so if there's a choke point at all for all this marine vessel traffic, that's the spot there. So Little Diomede, our job, our project was to look at, so in 2012, their once weekly helicopter service, the helicopter broke down, was out of commission, and people were getting stranded in Wales and Nome. So they would go into, they'd gone into the bigger town of Nome to get some maybe medical attention or help or shopping or something. And when they went to come back, the helicopter was out of service. It was out of service for several weeks. And so they had no way to get back. And our job was looking at, well, okay, what can we do to alleviate that issue? And so similar to an airport master plan, we looked at, took an inventory of things, did public outreach, and started really identifying what we had to work with. And so the challenges with developing anything at Little Diomede are pretty long. So the topography, if you can kind of see in the photograph there, but the community is perched on the side of the island. The island doesn't have any flat spots except for the very top. So around the whole, all sides of the island, it's this sort of large rock strewn just slope. And so that in itself is kind of limiting what you can do. Being in the Bering Strait, it's just, there's millions of seabirds that nest on the island, which is pretty impressive, but also something that has implications for any kind of construction or development out there. Then there's, of course, whales and some other marine mammals around in the area that have special regulations when it comes to development. The remote logistics of it, it's off the beaten path, and the lack of a real protected harbor there or anything makes it challenging to get goods out there even by boat. When the helicopter was down, the school district had to get their teachers out there, and they sent them on a boat, a fishing vessel, and they could get to the island and just couldn't get off the boat because the seas were too rough. And so they essentially spent a couple days sheltered on the opposite side of the island waiting for the weather to change so they could finally get them off of there. Extreme conditions during the Bering Strait, so you get some serious storms out there. And then as a very old community, there's a lot of cultural sites, both onshore and actually offshore. So, the Bering Land Bridge, there was settlement further down the hill, so to speak. And so there's underwater cultural sites right around the community that are another limiting factor in terms of development. And can't read the little chart there, but that just shows some of the permits that we identified would be needed just for something like developing a boat landing area. So lots of regulation and environmental concerns out there that make it challenging. So in our analysis, we kept everything on the table. We said, let's look at marine, let's look at air service. That could be in new infrastructure, new vessels, new vehicles. It could be in just finding a particular pot of money that we could somehow subsidize this, so there was maybe more than one helicopter or a different mechanism there. And also incorporating the community of Wales and how, if and when something were to happen again where there was no service for some amount of time, could there be some kind of facility in Wales for stranded families to have a place to stay? So we looked at everything. We looked at, I got some fun pictures here in a second. What kind of marine ferry vessel could we use? We looked at fixed wing and helicopter. We looked at hovercrafts, amphibious vehicles. We even considered momentarily an airship and how that might look, and something more ice-worthy, so an icebreaker or ice-capable vessel. And at the time, Matsu-Buro was selling their motor vessel Susitna, but even at $80 million, it was a little spendy there. So just to kind of point out again, I guess the connection here. So Little Diomede out here in the Middle Bering Strait, Wales isn't that far away. When you fly into Wales, you can you can see Little Diomede out in the distance there on a clear day. Tin City's close to Wales, but it's not. There was a road, it's kind of worn out, washed away, so that would have to be rebuilt if you did any kind of connections between the two. But Wales itself doesn't have deep water, it's very shallow, so that you couldn't really develop any kind of ferry vessel infrastructure there. But at Tin City, they got deeper water, so you could do it there. So you'd have to somehow connect those two communities. And then we looked at going all the way back to Nome via marine elements, but decided that really just getting you to Teller is that much quicker. You're on the road system for the times of the year when you're going to be using boats anyway. So that we essentially eliminated the concept of a direct ferry from Little Diomede to Nome. And so I said we kept everything on the table. We looked at all kinds of stuff. And on the left there are some of the vessels that we looked at. So hovercraft, which has been used in other parts of the world, and I believe even in the YK Delta a little bit, they've got a hovercraft down there. Some limitations, of course, just because you can only go in water that's just so rough. There's sort of a civilian model of that Coast Guard vessel. I forget what it's called right off the top of my head, but it's very seaworthy. It wouldn't have any trouble with the kinds of waters that are out there. The issue you get into is who wants to ride on a vessel that's in terrible seas just to get home. So that was something we looked at. We looked at catamaran, we looked at landing crafts, we looked at all kinds of good stuff. And then the vessel is just one part of it. Developing the infrastructure at Diomede was the other component. And in Diomede, the Corps actually did some work in looking at developing a little bit more protected sort of like landing area. And so they gave us these renderings of some like breakwater type elements here where you could get a vessel in between them. And they looked at them at different points along the community. You can see that existing helipad is right here. Apparently there was a helicopter on there the day they took this photo. So. But the water drops off so sharply there that it's so deep, the amount of rock that it would take to build that up is almost cost prohibitive. And then we looked at aircraft options, and so the helicopter there is the one that's currently serving the community. So it's a little bit larger. I believe it holds 3 passengers plus the pilot. Also does the mail run. We looked at the Grumman Goose or something equivalent to that. That's what they were using out in Akutan before the airport was developed, and thought that might be viable. Again, with rough seas, it makes it a little challenging, and you'd still need some kind of landing or something for it, and you don't really have the level apron or space for an aircraft of that size to really pull out of the water without a lot of fill. And then we did look at, well, could we build an airport out there? I mean, heck, the top of the mountain's flat. So could you build something that would really accommodate a fixed-wing aircraft? So here's another rendering of the community with a 3,000-foot runway that is built kind of by cutting away part of the island and repurposing that cut for some fill. And kind of your best case scenario is that location there. But you know, this 3,000-foot runway would cost over $200 million. And when we spoke to pilots about this concept, they said the winds would be crazy and you wouldn't be able to land there most of the time anyway because of the proximity of the mountain and just the way the winds come off the water there. The DOT in the past had looked at a mountaintop runway, and I don't have any renderings of that, but the mountain top there is pretty flat. The only problem is you'd have a runway up there, but no way really to get from it to the community without building some fairly complicated road or trail up the side of the mountain. Or the other option they looked at was a tunnel from the community into the mountain to an elevator shaft that would then take you up to the top of the rock there and to the airport. But again, very expensive, and starting to get borderline a little bit unrealistic, perhaps, in terms of like what happens if the elevator breaks, or those kinds of things. And again, the pilots were like, well, the wind's coming over that flat top with the sheer sides are pretty intense, so not really something that would be usable as often as we might think. So we looked at the Wales connection that I mentioned. We did some surveys and some interviews with folks both in Wales and in Little Diomede, and we made it to Wales. We didn't make it to Little Diomede, but when we were in Wales, they told us their concerns about family that's trying to get back to Little Diomede, being stuck in Wales, and you can only have your family visiting you for so long, right, before it starts to get old. And so we looked at some kind of bunkhouse and how that could factor in, whether it was something out by the airport or something right in the town that maybe the local IRA could take care of. The funding for stuff like this started to get complicated because we were looking at it kind of from a DOT perspective, and so we kind of sketched in all different possible ways you could fund the sort of thing and how the maintenance would work and who would be the upkeeper and everything. And this is the bunkhouse idea is kind of just one component of those air and marine options, because no matter what, you've still got to make that final leg between Wales and Diomede. So in the end, we looked at all kinds of options, and most of them had really big price tags and really complicated environmental impacts and environmental constraints. And our study recommended working to get the ATNEP program funding, which they have in place now. So ATNEP is the Air Transportation for Non-Eligible Places, and it's kind of like Essential Air Service, but it requires a 50-50 match. And so I believe the match was coming from State and Coeric, the Native community out there. And last I knew, that was still going. And so they had regular helicopter service, and it was funded, and things were a little bit better. But, they still use the ice runway when they can, but going forward, that window is getting smaller and smaller, and it's really not going to be a viable option too far down the road. So that was a fun project, and fun to try and get out to some of these communities. So that's a lot of me talking, and I guess I thank you for letting me talk so much, and I will take questions now, and I can go back to slides or whatever works for folks, and maybe I'll stop sharing so that you guys I can see you.
I'm going to be the interpreter, so if you guys have questions, they tell me I have to repeat the questions so Patrick can hear them.
I have a question.
Okay.
It has to do with the Smith Bay oil development and how that's going to affect access to Barrow, because the road and pipelines getting awful close.
Okay. How will the Smith Bay development affect
The
Barrow?
community plan?
How would
Right.
Smith Bay development affect? Can you hear the questions?
I can hear that one. So, yeah, Smith Bay is the one that Kalis Energy has said there's like 2 billion barrels or some crazy number like that. I don't know if you guys, anybody noticed the governor's, there was an article yesterday or the day before about this sort of line item in the governor's budget about a North Slope Roads network plan that he wants to explore, and that would include some connections to Smith Bay, both from the Barrow side and from the Dalton Highway side. I don't know that so far Smith Bay has had any impact from Barrow. I think that the distance there is enough that they don't have existing infrastructure in place to get out to it. But I know Kalis would really like there to be some. I don't know if that answers your question at all. That wasn't a discovery that was available at the time of the master plan, so we were looking more in the other direction, the offshore stuff versus that more coastal stuff.
Yeah,
That is the question.
that answers it. I knew that information was a recent development and planning proceeded.
Great. Any other questions? Are there any questions from our online audience?
I don't see them typing anything, so I don't think so.
Okay. Well, if that's the case, then we'll thank you, Patrick, for your presentation, and we'll close it up. The password for today's survey is planning, all lowercase. 2 N's. Right.
All right, I'll sign off. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick.
$200 million is $2 million per resident.
Are they going forward with the Bay development?
With the oil prices and things like that, that's all a driver too.
Yeah.
But it's just that the roads are getting a little closer to the barrel now. By the time you go up there, might find road access to it.
Well, I just had some time that I wanted. Yeah.
Legally, there's only one way to there's no hole. And you also put anything out there. It is just my idea.